So most of you have heard of the concept of original sin, right? It's this idea that all of humanity descended from these first two humans, Adam and Eve. And since Eve ate the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, and we are her descendants, we are born into the world already marked by her sin, generation after generation, forever and ever. Amen. Okay, you're probably not going to be surprised to hear I have a whole lot of problems with this interpretation. First of all, it ignores the fact that this is a myth. This is a creation story, emphasis on the word story. It's a just-so story to explain something about where we come from, but it is not biological scientific proof. That's just the way it is. And so when we treat it that way, we miss the message in the story. But even if you wanted to just go in from a theological vantage point, we're in the Bible and we're going to stick with it just theologically, is this where original sin happens? The problem is the word sin is never used in that story. It doesn't come up in the story of Adam and Eve. It's just not there. The word sin is not in Genesis 2 or 3. It doesn't exist. The first time the word sin is used in the Bible is in the passage you just heard about Cain and his brother Abel. But before we dive into that story, I want to give a little bit of context because, as you've probably also noticed, the Bible is really, really long, and we jump around a lot. And so for me, it's helpful to remind myself of where we are in the unfolding. Okay, so the first book in the Bible, Genesis, starts out with these two back-to-back creation narratives. First, we have the story that you know that takes place over 7 days, where God separates the water from the land, and the earth from the sky, and the light from the dark, and then creates all of the plants and all of the animals and the humans as well. This version of the creation story is then followed by a second, different creation story. And in that story, the earth starts out as dry, bare ground. And God creates rivers and grows a garden. Poor little muffin. And then after creating rivers and gardens, then God makes the first human named Adam from the Adamah, the soil. So God makes this little dirt being and then blows breath into its body. So in this version of the creation story, we are literally children of soil and breath. But in both stories, even though they are different stories, what it shares in common is that God doesn't create something from nothing. God starts with something there. God has a partner in creation, earth. So in the first story, the Spirit of God hovers over this already existent place and starts kind of classifying and separating things out. In the second story, the earth is there and God becomes the tiller or the gardener of the earth. And then in that story, God specifically creates humans in order to be the tillers and the keepers of the garden. It's easy from our modern perspective to miss earth in this story, to miss that earth is actually a character in the story. Most of us in this room don't make our living from the earth. Most of us rely on the labor of others buying our groceries at stores or local farms and markets. But of course, the early hearers of this story would have heard this through agrarian ears. They would have seen the world through agrarian eyes. And so Earth's place in the story would have been self-evident to them. Well, that gets us through Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So let's jump into Genesis 3, and that's where we find Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And as you know, they disobey God's command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And instead, they listen to the crafty serpent, and they eat the fruit from that tree, and then their eyes are opened, and they become crafty just like the serpent. And then, of course, God gets really ticked off and boots them right out of the garden. And then they're stuck out on the land that hasn't been prepared by God to try to grow things from scratch. And it's really, really hard work. And that brings us right up to Genesis 4, where we start today. Now, this fourth chapter of Genesis starts out with Eve conceiving and giving birth. And when she does so, she declares, "I have produced a man with the help of the Lord." And she names that first child Cain, and that means to acquire or possess. Hang on to that little tidbit. I'm going to come back to it. So then, it says in the text that Eve gives birth to Cain's brother, Abel. And his name translates to mean vapor or breath. So already the text is giving us clues about who these two characters are. Cain is described as a man, whereas Abel is only described as Cain's brother. Does anybody recognize that sibling dynamic from your own family? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's just my family. So I'm the bossy older sibling, and I love the spotlight as a child and still now. And I instantly see myself in that character of Cain. But maybe some of you are younger siblings, and you can empathize with going out into the world and simply being known as so-and-so's little brother or so-and-so's little sister, right? Well, so these boys grow up, and I imagine them in this story as teenagers, and the time has come for both of these young men to make an offering to God. And Cain has stepped into the work of his parents. He's a tiller of the ground. He's a gardener, and he grows food, and so he brings produce as his offering. And Abel has taken on probably the only other profession at the time and has become a shepherd, so he keeps the sheep. And when he makes his offering, he brings meat from these sheep. Now, there are tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of theories about why God likes Abel's offering more than Cain's offering. Maybe Abel gave a better or a bigger portion of his yield to God. Maybe God just likes meat a lot better than kale. We can't know this. And I actually don't even think it's particularly important to the story. Because what it's really about is that sibling rivalry is going to happen no matter if there's a good reason or not. And what matters is that God praised one child and not the other. So Cain responds not far off from how many kids respond and gets really, really angry. But he doesn't get angry at God. He gets angry at his brother, as if Abel had intentionally tried to show him up, right? And God sees that Cain is seething with jealousy and says to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." So there it is. That's the sentence where we first see sin in the entire Bible. Sin is lurking at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Now, as I understand this passage, God is not saying that, Cain, you're going to be accepted if next time you bring me something I like better. That's not what it's saying. What it's saying is, the emotions that you're experiencing, Cain, the emotions that are severing you from your brother, they've brought you to a critical crossroads. Sin is lurking there, and it's threatening to take hold of you. So you have to master it, presumably by getting these feelings under control and remembering that your love for your brother is far more important than this moment. And if you do this, you will look well in my eyes. But if you don't do this, there are going to be problems. And so Cain, of course, does not get his feelings under control, as we know. And instead, this willful man-child goes out and lets his feelings get the best of him, and he lures his brother out into the field, and he turns against him, and he kills him. And he literally possesses Cain, his breath, Abel. Now God returns to the scene and asks Cain where Abel is, and like any petulant teen who knows that they've messed up, Cain responds by being an obstinate brat face. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? But God, of course, already knows the answer. And I'm going to read God's response, but I'm going to use the King James translation because I love the wording. And it says, "The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And now art thou cursed by the earth, which has opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, she shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shall thou be on the earth." Theologian Günther Wittenberg writes about this passage, and he points out that to modern ears, it may sound like there are only two characters having dialogue in this passage, the Cain and God. But in fact, there's this other central character, and that's the earth. He writes, "The Adamah, the earth, appears here as a living organism which has opened her mouth and gulped the blood of Abel down her throat. And blood-filled, the earth cries out against the abomination of the crime. Finally, the earth reacts to the murder by withholding her strength and her fertility." Cain has ruptured his relationship with his brother. Cain has ruptured his relationship with the earth. And Cain has ruptured his relationship with God. And this, of course, is how it works, right? All these things are interconnected. You break one, and everything begins to be broken. So now Cain is exiled from his family and from God and from the earth upon which he depended for his livelihood. He no longer has a community, a home, a place of belonging. And he's a fugitive. He's forced to wander, to be landless. And this, of course, would be kind of the worst punishment a farmer could think about. So Cain is bereft, and he says, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face." Do you hear that? To be disconnected from the soil is to be disconnected from God's face. And here it is that we begin to see the strong bias of the authors. Cain, the first murderer, also the first sinner, goes on to become the founder of the first city, right? So I happen to love cities. I have lived in them and really enjoy them, and when it comes down to it, I'm a pretty terrible farmer. So I'm not going to judge folks who don't like to get their hands in the dirt. But I still think it's interesting to notice that in our modern context, though we still rely on farmers to feed us, many of those actual farmers struggle to make a living. And I think it's worth keeping this in mind, this noticing that the Judeo-Christian tradition puts the people who work the land at a different place, sees them as blessed, sees them as connected to the holy. Well, this, of course, brings us to our celebration for today. It's Rogation Sunday at South Church. It's our take on a tradition that goes all the way back to the 5th century. The Latin root of the word rogare means to petition or to ask something from God. Now, this holiday used to be celebrated 4 times a year, the first of which was in April. And on Rogation days, the congregation would walk around the church's property and sometimes even around farms in the area, and they would bless the land and they would thank the land for the harvest. So, as you know, at this Sunday, at the end of our service, we will process out to the garden and we will bless the land and we will thank the land for its fertility. This bountiful little garden that we have in the back, the Garden of Gratitude, was cultivated entirely by volunteer labor. It's guided by the earthy wisdom of Arlene Shannon, who is just a garden maven and knows how to make these things happen in a way that honors the earth. And she is supported in this venture by other members of the garden, Cindy Rising, Judy and Wes Goodwin, Lori Love and her grandson DeAnthony, who come, Debbie Rilletz and her son Ben, Becky Sears, Reverend Sandra, and Piper, as well as countless other guest farmers who have made it out for a day or two to work on things. And this group gathers on Wednesdays, and they weed, and they water, and they harvest, and they bless the garden with their hands, with their labor. And in addition, there are other folks like Gene Gill who donated his labor and the materials to run water all the way out to that garden, and also Sow and Reap, who have donated money to help with the supplies for the garden. So it is literally a community effort to make this garden happen. And last year it produced hundreds, it's tiny out there, hundreds of pounds of food, which were brought over to the Waste Not, Want Not meal and transformed into nourishing food for the folks using that service. And this cycle, the cycle of planting and growing and harvesting and feeding, it's a cycle in which relationships are rebuilt, where healing happens with the earth and with God and with one another. So now, up until this point, we've talked largely about farming and tilling, that of the roles. So today, in honor of Abel, who was our shepherd who gave the offering of meat, I want to share one final story. And I think this story is also a great example of the work where food can lie in the process of creating community and bringing people together in God's love. So this year, the youth group had its third annual Good Friday mini retreat. And each year the youth gather, and we have dinner around a low table, much like they would have in the first century in the Christian communities. And there are candles on the table, and everybody lounges around on cushions, and it's great fun. And this year, I asked the youth to each bring a dish that was either a family signature dish or a dish that reminded them of an experience where they felt connection. Jamie Masrick brought this noodle dish that reminded her of a night with her best friend when they created a magic meal from what appeared to be an empty cupboard. Shannon Jennings brought these cookie bars that she had made with a group of friends when she was feeling really down, and it had lifted her up and reminded her of hope. Emily Cody made chicken tikka masala from scratch that she learned to make in 4th grade after seeing Slumdog Millionaire for the first time. Lori Love made these Christmas cookies out of just 3 ingredients that her mom used to make that stretched the ingredients to create this bountiful table of sweets that they could eat at the holidays. Jake Makeomer brought this decadent chocolate cake. I mean, it was seriously decadent chocolate cake that's got a secret recipe from their family, and they use it at all their major family gatherings and celebrations. And his girlfriend, Mai, brought lumpia, which is a dish from the Philippines that she learned to make from her grandmother when she was just a child. Every one of these dishes was delightful. It was filled with love, and you could taste that. But there was one other dish that really stood out, and it was brought by Will Rice. Now, Will, for those of you who don't know him, is a man of few words. He's a second son, and when he arrived to youth group, everyone lovingly called him Mini Yames, which was a nickname because his older brother is James, so he was the mini version. Over the years, I've come to know Will as a guy who isn't going to say much, but is always listening intently and is willing to pitch in and help. Recently, I heard that he had shoveled a congregant's driveway when the snow had gotten so high her snowblower couldn't get it up that high. So he spent a good while shoveling her out and then left before she could pay, which is very Will for you. And on this night, in classic Will fashion, he produced his dish without any fanfare, and he held it up and said, "This is some barbecue and some sauce. It's my uncle's recipe from Tennessee." That was it. Over. So I tasted it, and it was heaven. This was really, really good barbecue. So I needed to know more, and I pressed him for details. How did you, Will, a teenage boy living in Granby, Connecticut, make what tastes like fine restaurant-style Southern barbecue? Explain. And he said, well, I started out this morning by smoking the pork shoulder first thing when I got up. And then after I smoked it for a while, I roasted it for 6 more hours. And then I was like, but what about the sauce? And he was like, oh, I made that. I was like, you made it from scratch? Yeah. It's like a Coca-Cola base, and then you add all these other things. There's some cumin. He explains the whole thing. And I'm blown away because he's 16. And And it's just overwhelming the amount of time. That's like 8 hours of prep to make a potluck dish. In fact, for this morning, I considered asking Will if he would make a bunch of this barbecue so that we could eat it in church and have like barbecue communion. But I couldn't figure out just how we would do it without getting the pews all sticky. And so I had to put that idea to rest. But the point that I am trying to make is that it was not only really good, but you could taste that a whole day of love and care had gone into this. And this was Will's way of honoring this group of people and of sharing himself the best he knew how. At the end of our passage for today, we hear that Adam and Eve go on to have a third son. And they name him Seth, which can be translated to mean redemption or second chance. This got me thinking, because you see, food is something that we eat every single day, hopefully multiple times every single day. And every mouthful is a gift from the earth and also a gift from God. The original sin in the Bible is not that Adam and Eve took and ate of the fruit. The original sin is the moment that Cain broke his sacred bonds through ego and violence. Well, we still live in a world where there are a lot of ego and violent stories. But we've been given a second chance. Each and every meal is an opportunity that we have, an opportunity to rebuild our connections with the land, an opportunity to rebuild our connection with God, an opportunity to rebuild our connections with each other. And there's nothing at all that could be more delicious than that.